Well, I would say to kind of sum all of these up, because there's obviously a theme of pride amongst all of them.
Yeah.
But I think the real issue is whether it's our sexuality, our race, our relationships with other people, or our career that we choose.
Yeah.
The primary issue is we're trying to define ourselves.
Sure.
We're trying to say, I am this, or I'm a list of these attributes or things that I do. And I think the problem is primarily that we're trying to find our identity in something that is temporal, that is limited in nature.
And these are the things that make me valuable.
And these are the things that this is why I'm valuable.
Yes.
I think that's the big issue.
We are back again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of the Identity Crisis podcast, where we endeavor to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, yet doing so with gentleness and respect. I am your co-host, Jaylen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
Dill, how you feeling today, man? What's the word?
I'm feeling pretty prideful. No, not
really. Here you go, man. Oh my gosh.
You know, how prideful of you to try to educate people about pride. Why are you so proud?
I'm proud to have pride.
No, well, there you go.
Proud to have pride.
Proud to have pride.
I don't know. Does that work?
Sure.
Yeah, it does. Because when it's all about pride, it's all about me. So if I say it works, it works.
I like it. So obviously, we got our hot topic today of pride. We're going to be looking at it from a historical lens. We're going to be looking at it from a biblical perspective and trying to see how it's kind of viewed in the world today.
Yeah, for sure. And before we get started, I suppose we need to throw out a quick disclaimer because we always talk about the etymology of words and stuff like that. Sure. And nowadays, when you hear a word like pride, your mind goes in a certain direction, right?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that a little bit today. It'll get brought up some, but this is not an episode about homosexuality or LGBTQ. And it's not what it's about.
Yeah, specifically the word pride.
Yes, the word pride in and of itself and its more historical context in terms of its definition.
Yeah.
So let's dig into that, as a matter of fact.
Let's do it.
This pride word, definition.
So one way we can look at it, a general definition of the word pride is it's a feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own achievements, the achievements of those with whom is closely associated, or from qualities or possessions that are widely admired. So I think that's a good one way to look at it. There's a couple of other theologians in church history that I think kind of help flesh it out a little more precisely.
Yeah, like Saint Augustine. I like the way he defined it. He said that pride can be defined as the love of one's own excellence.
Jeez. And I think an interesting thing about that is, like, for example, if I am at work or if I'm working on something and I complete a task, like, yeah, I did a good job. It's probably not what he's talking about.
Yeah, I think he's getting a little deeper than that.
Yeah, it'd be like, man, look at me.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, maybe.
Yeah, like in spite of the work, like regardless of the work, like before any work gets done, like look at me.
Right.
Almost like a kid in the mirror, like just fascinated with their own reflection in the mirror, like just sitting there admiring it and stuff like that. My daughter does that.
Yeah.
It's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. But yeah, I think that he's more so just talking about a far deeper type of pride. And then you got St. Thomas Aquinas. He defined pride as an excessive desire for one's own self, which rejects subjection to God.
That one's a little more direct.
For sure.
Yeah, so I mean, one way to look at it is, so like we said, it's a little more, I like this one a lot because it's a little more direct. It's excessive desire. I think it's okay to be have a little bit of self-esteem and be like, yeah, I did a good job on this thing. I'm making good progress here and there. That's not really what the excess of pride is really talking about. It's excessive desire for one's own self. And then if you look at that, one thing I was really thinking about today, this is kind of like, pride would be like the antithesis of humility.
Absolutely.
And it would also be the antithesis of following wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. And so
like Proverbs.
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly.
Okay.
So, I mean, one way that we can kind of tie these together is that if I am not comparing myself to this ineffable standard beyond me,
Mm-hmm.
I might think that I'm awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I might think that I'm the bee's knees. I got everything down.
Mm-hmm.
But when I start really comparing myself to God in that sense, having this sort of awe, this reverence of awe,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding that I need to put myself in line,
Mm-hmm.
it can really start to check the pride balance, the humility balance there a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And now I'm sitting here thinking about that. And I was thinking about you talking about how the fear of the Lord or humility is like the beginning of wisdom. Pride is like in a way, pride is almost like the antithesis of wisdom.
oh,
Then
interesting.
if you think about it in that way, right? Because I believe it's Proverbs 12, verse 1, I think. It says, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is stupid. And
Does it really render it as stupid?
yes,
Oh wow,
yeah, it's in there.
that's pretty funny.
Yeah, and so
Bible would be sassy, dude.
yeah, but if you think about it though, in that way, like if you love discipline, you love knowledge, but if you hate correction, right, in pride, I mean, correction never happens, right?
Sure.
Right. If prideful people can't take correction.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm proud, I don't like correction. So in a way, like that's the antithesis of wisdom, is to be proud.
Yeah,
And it also renders you stupid because you can't be corrected.
that's interesting. I like that. I think that's a good way to kind of frame it, because like you think of someone who has a lot of struggle and issues with getting constructive criticism.
For sure.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of like what you're saying there, where someone might give you some criticism or some ways to improve, and it's really easy to get defensive.
Yeah.
And just like, oh, what do they know? And everything like that. And that would be a great representation of like an inflated ego, of this sort of prideful perspective.
Yeah, it's like they know that you don't know.
Right.
So that's what they know. Yeah. But so we talked about like this. I kind of want to hang out with St. Thomas Aquinas for a little bit because I like his definition. I'm sorry, the excessive desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ancient Greeks had a concept of pride that kind of correlated with his definition a little more, and I kind of liked where their thinking was with it. I kind of want to talk about it a little bit. They called it. I'm about to butcher this, but is it hubris, hubris?
Hubris.
Yeah, hubris. So they define pride as access or the overindulgence in access.
Excess, yeah.
Yeah. So that's their definition. And then for them, pride was directly opposed to the concept of temperance, self-control, and reason.
Okay.
And that kind of goes back to whoever loves discipline loves knowledge. Whoever hates correction is stupid.
Oh wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how they looked at it. And then also for them, the idea of pride was very dangerous, or the overindulgence in excess of self is very dangerous, and it also could lead to self-annihilation.
Jeez.
What do you think about that?
Oh, honestly, it kind of makes me think about, we have kind of like a mental health epidemic going on, especially like these last 50 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
There could be many reasons why that is the case. I'm not a psychologist or anything by any means, but one of the things you'll notice with people with excessive issues with anxiety disorder, well, the primary thing that they're typically thinking about is themselves or situations directly related to themselves. Now, I'm not saying this to like put someone down who is like genuinely struggling with this sort of mental health issue of having excessive anxiety and stuff like that. But when you really start to think about, okay, well, what's one of the common links about these anxious and intrusive thoughts, these that's very excessive in nature, is it's all surrounded around yourself,
right?
In some sense.
Sure.
And so I think it's really interesting, this idea that could lead to self-annihilation. Well, it kind of puts you in a pit of despair and frustration if you're constantly focused on what you think and what others think about you at the end of the day. I mean, especially when you think about like social anxiety disorder, where you're just so concerned about how you're perceived in a social environment.
Sure.
And again, this is a terrible thing. I'm not saying this to put someone down who's struggling with it, but at the root of it, it's kind of similar to the idea of pride, where you're excessively thinking about yourself. And that's why you have things like DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, where you're really trying to retrain your thoughts in some sense and trying to point it in a direction where you're thinking about something else. And so it kind of brings it back to that wisdom, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord and everything like that. Well, I could think about myself at the end of the day, or I could think about something greater than myself, or I could think about doing something that doesn't involve me necessarily.
Sure. Or doing something that I don't directly benefit from, or isn't all about my benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Absolutely.
So let's talk about this idea though of this kind of pride and it leading to self annihilation. And because I feel like we see this kind of pride here in the West a lot. I feel like this type of pride is very prevalent. I think it's the calling card of the culture, honestly. And so I kind of want to talk about like where we see this type of pride on display today. Where some of the areas you see this kind of pride?
Well, one of the primary things would probably be your source of income or your career.
For sure.
So a lot of times our identity, even so, can be rooted in what you do. Like one of the first questions someone might ask you, and this isn't like a bad question to ask, it's just, what do you do for work?
Sure.
Like, okay, I know your name's Jaylen. What do you do? Because this is going to be directly tied to your status, who you are, and all this.
Your worth.
Yeah, you're worthy to me based on your position in society, based on your career.
Sure.
And so part of it could just be like a basic social byproduct of like having those sorts of conversations. But also like we glamorize people who have these sort of esteemed positions like high political leaders or actors and musicians and all of these sort of positions. And it can be really easy to get self-inflated.
Yeah. I mean, or we can even like bring it down to like maybe a lower level, not just the political and the actors and the actresses, the athletes, rappers, and all those guys. Even like the average guy trying to go up the corporate ladder, right? I mean, even that guy, you can see this kind of pride on display. Who is willing to sacrifice time with his children, time with his wife, sacrifice his family, sacrifice sleep, sacrifice his own health for the accolades, the awards, the promotions, the raises that lay themselves before him as opportunities to advance. That's one way we can see that pride on display, and what he's willing to do or subject himself to or herself to get those promotions or get those advancements in their career. And I think that's one way you can see pride in that. You hear a lot of people who they work their way up the corporate ladder and somehow they get fired, right, from their job, and they end up like really depressed.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. I think that could be like a symptom of the fact that you put so much pride, or you took so much pride in your career. It was a part of your identity, kind of like how you just said it. Your career was a part of yourself, right? And in your excessive overindulgence, you couldn't tell the difference between work you and at home you.
Sure.
Right. And because of that, when you lost that job, let's say layoffs or whatever, or, whatever happened, you got depressed, or you were really sad, or, you've heard of even crazier things than that, people doing all types of things. And I think that could be because of that type of pride, that overindulges in excess in one's career.
Sure.
Being on display.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Another place you see this is in relationships.
Okay.
I think you see this kind of pride in relationships. What I mean by that today in particular, well, shout out to my red pill guys.
Oh my God.
Goofies. So you hear this a lot in like the question, what do you bring to the table?
Yeah, that's a lot of what you hear in the red pill sort of stuff.
That question is littered in pride.
Yeah.
And here's what I mean by that. Let me explain. The question, what do you bring to the table? There are some assumptions already made to that, right? So the assumption, one of the assumptions that's made to it is I deserve a certain level of lifestyle. I deserve a certain level of treatment, of access, of affluence, what have you. And you answering the question, what do you bring to the table? You allow me to vet what type of lifestyle you're going to be able to afford. You're going to be able to afford for me, and whomever else is attached to me. It also trying to figure out how I want to word it. It also the question also assumes that the person that's sitting on the other side of the table deems me worthy
Right.
of whatever they have to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times you don't know that yet, so you better be
Right,
careful with how you ask that question. you assume I want to give it to you first and foremost. And yeah, I just think that question in particular is just littered in pride and in how do you benefit me?
Sure.
That's kind of the underlying question to that. What do you think?
Well, it kind of reminds me of something, just kind of a funny small anecdote. I was watching this abortion debate between apologist Trent Horn and this guy named Destiny. And the red pill thing kind of came up, and both sides of them kind of teamed up against the guy. They're saying, no, like this whole red pill manosphere perspective is just wrong in many respects. So it's not like this is just like one side of the aisle talking down to another. This is like an issue in general. There's like this, I see it a lot because I was very curious when all of this like sort of red pill content was kind of coming out. And it's just this inflated sense of self. And one thing you'll notice is there's these impossible standards that the men, I wouldn't say impossible, but these high standards that they're putting on other women.
Sure.
That they themselves are not holding up to.
Yeah.
Like one thing you'll notice in this sort of manosphere perspective, there's just like, well, the woman needs to be a virgin or have very low amount of sexual partners.
Sure.
Never does the man ever say, and I also have a low amount of sexual partners.
Yeah, so it's like if you're going around sleeping with all the women, who are going to be the virgins?
Right. So, I mean, if you're part of the problem,
right?
Because, I mean, it takes two to tango at the end of the day.
That's what I thought.
And you're putting this sort of standard on women that you yourself are not even holding. I mean, it just makes you're trying to inflate yourself, but you look really, really small at the end of the day.
And that's the pride in it, right? It's one thing. Once again, what do you bring to the table? What's in it for me? What benefits come with you that I get to enjoy?
Right.
Right.
And it's funny.
And that's pride.
Yeah. And one thing that's really funny about that topic specific that I mentioned is sometimes they'll write it off. It's like, oh, well, men have evolved to just be conquerors and hunters and all of that. And one thing that's really funny is let's grant the argument for a moment. Like, sure, men have evolved in that sense to be able to propitiate their genome through whatever means necessary at one point in human history. Let's grant the argument for a moment. What you're telling me is that you have no control over your own sexual desires and that you are a slave to these sort of sexual desires and you aren't able to really control them. But women should be able to control them. Because you're not mature enough or you're not capable of having restraint. Because when I think about restraint and strength and being able to control oneself, self-control, these would be representatives of a high-value man, which I say with high quotations, not someone who's just going off on a whim and responding to whatever sort of excessive, hedonistic, narcissistic desire pops into their head and acting upon it.
Yeah, and since we're here real quick, and then we'll get off them because there's no reason to talk about them more than we have to. Essentially, in that community, as a man, and just listening to them, the ideas for the man is once I hit a certain economic status or a certain income level, that grants me access to behave in whichever way I want to sexually, because I can provide a certain lifestyle for whatever women I'm choosing to entertain. And that's just absolutely ridiculous. Because essentially, like if you're a man, there's no reason to really even bother trying to exercise self-control. Just go chase the money. And then once you get to whatever that dollar amount is where you can no longer care about what anybody thinks about you morally, well, then you're good to go. Because I don't have to care what anybody thinks about me.
Right.
I can just do whatever I want and pay for whatever I want to pay for. And that's pretty much the end of that.
Right.
But once again, that doesn't really work.
So here's a fun one for you to talk about. I feel like we talked a lot about the self in general.
Yeah.
But one thing you see a lot today is pride in your own race or the color of your skin.
Oh, for sure. Yep.
It's a big thing in America. I'm kind of curious in your perspective on that because one time in history, we saw a lot of issues with white pride or white supremacy and all this sort of stuff.
Sure.
But now you're kind of seeing... there's like an economics term for like an overcorrection. So the pendulum is swinging way in the opposite way. So clearly white supremacy or white pride is a terrible thing. It's silly to be prideful of the pigmentation of your skin. You had no control over that anyways. It's just you got the lucky number in the draw, which I hesitate even saying because it's the pigmentation of your skin color.
Right.
But now it's swinging in the opposite direction, where now people are putting down others who don't have darker skin, and they're taking this deep pride in their darker complexion. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's still as silly as it was when white supremacy was the norm, if you will. To take pride in your skin color, I mean, essentially to worship it. That's really what pride is anyway, is the worship of self. And in this case, we're worshiping a particular skin color, culturally. And you just, like you said, you're just taking this pendulum from one end and swinging it all the way to the other. And it's not even, I wouldn't even call it an overcorrection. It's, we were wrong over here, and now we're just wrong on this side. Right. Right. We're just on the other side of it, but we're still wrong. Right. And that, I mean, that's pretty much that on that one, but you do see that one a lot, today. Politicians, they do really well in this department. They, I mean, there's much to be said about it. I mean, you're just taking pride in something, like you said, you got no control over. This just is what it is. And I'm like, well, yeah. And I guess the way it can look, particularly, I guess, if you want to talk about, believers who are minorities, it can look like me, putting my skin color over my, devotion to Christ. Mm-hmm. And I guess, I suppose whites can do that. Mexicans can do that. Anybody can do that. But I guess that's what that can look like overall is, Dale, you and I can't worship together because, you're white and I'm black. Mm-hmm. We can't worship Jesus together, because of that. Or, I feel uncomfortable in white churches. Sure. Because they're white.
Yeah, because I'm there to make sure that my complexion matches the room, right? That's the reason that I'm there.
And that's the pride. That's taking pride in skin color. Another one we see a lot today is pride in sexuality. Okay. That's another one that's super heavy today. And the idea of essentially that's us worshiping ourselves through our sexuality, our sexual identities. Then you can go down that rabbit hole all day long, right? From everything from the idea of just sex in general and worshiping and pleasure, the idea of who I prefer to sleep with, taking pride in that, and that being the overall I don't want to put it, the overarching way that I identify myself, right? And taking pride in that. You see that a lot. Trying to think what else in regards to sexuality. What do you think?
Well, I would say to kind of sum all of these up, because there's obviously a theme of pride amongst all of them. Yeah. But I think the real issue is whether it's our sexuality, our race, our relationships with other people, or our career that we choose. Yeah. The primary issue is we're trying to define ourselves. Sure. We're trying to say, I am this, or I'm a list of these attributes or things that I do. And I think the problem is primarily that we're trying to find our identity in something that is temporal, that is limited in nature.
And these are the things that make me valuable.
And these are the things that this is why I'm valuable.
Yes.
I think that's the big issue. And when you really look at all these things, it's primarily a philosophical and a spiritual issue at the end of the day. Because you're trying to find identity, worth, filling this sort of hole that we all have within us in something that is not big enough to fill it. Yeah. I think C.S. Lewis said something like, all of us have a Christ-shaped hole inside of all of us that only he can fill. Facts. And so if I should be trying to root my identity not in these localized temporal things, but I should be rooting my identity in something transcendent, something that goes beyond not only my relationships, how I perceive myself, but how God himself perceives me. And how he is calling me out of, we'll say, the animality, all of these sort of lower things amongst us. Yeah. And he's calling us up out of that to be made and conformed to the image of Christ. Yes. Because if you think about what it truly means to be human, it would be to look more like Christ at the end of the day. It would be this constant push of not thinking about myself, this sort of prideful behavior,
Mm-hmm.
but giving love freely.
Mm-hmm.
And in excessive love would be a really good way to look at the the antithesis of pride,
Mm-hmm.
which is excessive desire of oneself or inflation of oneself.
Yes.
And so I think that's really the main issue with all of these things, and why I have a lot of concern for people who really have this sort of inflated sense of self, where they're trying to find their identity in all of these sort of smaller, lower things, rather than in something that is transcendent. Because really, I just don't think these will ever be enough.
Sure. And I guess since we're on Christ, well, I'm going to just kind of dig into some of the biblical understanding of pride.
Sure.
So the biblical understanding of pride, it kind of closely parallels the Greek understanding of pride, which is what we were just talking about. And the Hebrew word for this type of pride is pisha.
Pisha.
Yeah, pisha. P-E-S-H-A. And actually the word means transgression. And it can also be closely correlated to rebellion.
Okay.
Which is interesting, the word rebellion, because included in the biblical understanding of pride are the ideas of arrogance, cynical insensitivity to the needs of others, and presumption.
Well, yeah, it's also, I don't want to say assuming, but it's kind of inferring that hubris is violating some sort of moral law that we all sort of share.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only a violation against everything that could be transcended, but it's also kind of a violation against yourself.
Correct.
And so in some way, the pride is kind of a way that I'm not treating myself properly, ironically.
Sure.
Because it's so focused on yourself, but you're hurting yourself in the process.
Yeah, which I guess is what part of what leads to the self-annihilation is. It's you annihilating yourself,
Mm-hmm.
which is very counterproductive and backwards in a way.
Right.
Because I'm so concerned with myself that I end up being my own demise.
Mm-hmm.
Which is very interesting. But also included in the biblical understanding of pride are the ideas of obviously arrogance, like I just said, cynical insensitivity to the needs of others, presumption, and then also pride is viewed as a disposition or an attitude, but and then it's also a type of conduct,
Okay.
as well. So I can have a proud attitude, a proud demeanor, but then I also can act prideful as well.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like a state of being. It's like a way that I conduct myself.
Yeah.
And it's these individual actions that I'm choosing. Because I always have a choice to either act in humility or act in pride. You might have a disposition naturally towards one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an active choice of the will.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like a state of being and a state of mind that you kind of enter in or are just in.
Right. And I suppose that can help to explain what happened in the garden, right?
Sure.
With Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to read Genesis 3 verses 1 through 7.
Okay.
Just to kind of read this account and kind of see where we can find the pride and all this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, 'You shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of the good and evil, the tree that is in the midst of the garden. You shall not touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths."
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that.
So one interesting thing I was kind of thinking about before the episode today, it kind of made me think of this really cheesy imagery you saw in like earlier cartoons with like the angel on one shoulder,
Yeah,
and like the little devil on your right shoulder.
Uh-huh.
Obviously, it's kind of a goofy imagery, but there's obviously some good symbolic truth to that. Like you could choose to be in line with the good or be in line with the bad.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, you could say that Eve heard the testimony of what is good for her. And then now she's hearing the perspective of what is bad for her. And now she's trying to choose which one to do. And the interesting thing is, so we know that she chose the wrong thing to do,
Sure.
so to speak. And now she starts to justify why it is good to do these things. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and it was a delight to the eyes, so she's listing, oh, well, it can't be that bad. It must be good for food. It's going to make me wise, all of this sort of things. She took the fruit and then she shared it. So she's also not only taking this thing that she originally thought it was bad, but after a while of communing with what is not good, with what is evil, she's convinced herself that not only it's good, and then she's justifying it through a sort of virtue signaling by sharing it with others. We'll see, look how good and wise I am. I am taking this to grow, and I'm going to give it to others as well. So it's this complete justification of, look how great I am. I'm doing this good thing, even though originally I thought this was the opposite of what was good. And we could see the fruit of that, no pun intended, what happens. And so then the eyes of both were open, which is a really cool symbolic way to say that these early humans were first being self-conscious for the first time. And the first thing they notice is that they're naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons to cover themselves. Because all of a sudden, you could kind of go in reverse order with this. It's like, okay, so why do we act in a prideful way? It's because we're insecure about other things, perhaps. So we're almost using this pride as these sort of fig leaves to kind of cover up the parts of ourselves that we're insecure about. And so until these early humans were capable of having self-conscious thoughts or negative emotions and things like that, for lack of better terms, and I mean that in more a vague sense, not an extremely technical sense, that the fruit of this prideful behavior led to very self-conscious behavior. And now whenever a lot of us deal with pride, a lot of it is kind of like the fig leaves in some sense. We're trying to cover up these insecure areas of our lives, things where we feel like we're lacking. And the irony is we're drawing and grabbing from these localized, temporal, insufficient means to ground our identity and sense of self, rather in God, who is looking out not only for our best interests, but our best development and growth.
Well, see, but check this out though, right? See how cunning the serpent is though? Because in his proposition to Adam and Eve, right? He kind of proposed to them in a way that they really aren't all that they could be.
Okay.
If you think about it, like he kind of like dangled this carrot in front of them that like you're good, but things can be better. You have another level that you can reach. Almost like kind of planting the idea of like kind of like self-consciousness, kind of like planting that in their idea. Like, wait a minute, is something wrong with me? Like, like what if I'm not all that I could be? And he kind of planted that idea in their head. And if they ate this fruit, that they will reach this level of pride, but self-actualization or self-realization that God was supposedly hiding from them in this tree. If that kind of makes sense. And so, like you said, they take this fruit and they eat it. And the first thing that they realize is themselves. And it's like their eyes open and I realize my own deficiencies. I'm naked. Well, I've been naked all this time. It wasn't a problem. Why is it a problem now? I think it's a problem now because now where God was the ultimate good or the standard upon which I was looking upon and also the origin of where I got my value and my self-actualization, my self-perception from, I've replaced him off and removed him from that throne and put myself there now, or put this image of myself that I think I'm not on that throne now. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now I'm chasing whatever that is for me, as opposed to whatever God said that I was supposed to be or that I already am. I've thrown all that out of the window and now I'm up there on that throne and I'm chasing this idea of self.
Interesting. Yeah. So you've reoriented your hierarchy of values. And so God is no longer at the top. And instead you've, in some sense, either put yourself at the top, or to put it in a more modern perspective, I've put these other idols and these other insufficient means of worship at the top, like my career or my relationships and things like that. And I'm realizing that there's a giant hole that none of these limited things are capable of filling. And so I'm going to keep trying to put energy and effort and work into these things. But as much time and effort I put in, which also results in my pride, it's just never going to be enough.
Right. I'm chasing after the wind, like our buddy King Solomon says.
Right.
I'm chasing after vapor, hevel,
Yeah.
as he calls it. But I want to talk about that last observation that the author of Genesis records that Eve saw in the tree, and that was that she saw that it was to be desired to make one wise.
Mm-hmm.
And we were just kind of talking about this before, like with wisdom and the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom, and humility kind of being the beginning of wisdom. It's interesting how Satan kind of flipped it, and he kind of propositioned Eve to think that wisdom would be the what you need in order to become your highest self.
Okay.
When really that wasn't what she needed. She really needed humility to become her highest self, right? But with her the last observation that she made about the tree was that it's desirable to make me wise. So in a way, it was like her acknowledging, I'm not wise yet.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But she thought that if I eat this and I become wise, this would help me to realize or actualize this version of myself that I'm striving to become. Mm-hmm. But if were to flip it back to where God ordained it, you were already that.
Right.
All of you had to do was be humble and submit yourself to the guidelines and the structure that the Lord had provided for you already.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's almost like an earthly wisdom in a way.
Yeah.
And then you think about, what did she and Adam desire to do with this wisdom that they were trying to obtain? Mm-hmm. Right. And that was to obviously elevate themselves to a certain level of knowledge where they thought they would no longer need God anymore because they were essentially going to become him.
Yeah, I think a good way to kind of summarize that all together is pride is a little more concerned with who is right, where humility is more concerned about what is right.
Right.
Trying to subjugate yourself to what is good and beautiful and true, rather than trying to inflate yourself as the very good, most beautiful and true thing there is. You know what I mean? So I think that's like a good way to kind of put a little end bow on that sort of concept with Genesis. But maybe we could reflect just a little bit briefly on how these inflations of ourselves through pride has kind of really affected people in the modern world today.
For sure.
I think we see it a lot with broken relationships in general.
Absolutely.
So I mean, if you just look at modern dating, for example, I mean, when like Tinder and Bumble and all this stuff started hitting the market, the dating scene completely changed.
Yeah.
Hookup culture has gotten inflated really hard, and I'm not saying this is the only reason why these things happen by any means, but there's certainly an element of pride to this sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like before, like if you think of maybe 40 years ago or something like that, the norm was to date one person at a time. Whether or not you think that's correct is besides the point. I'm just saying that was just kind of the social norm here in America. Now the norm is I'll start dating one person when it's official, but it's kind of like this nebulous dating scene. I'll kind of date or possibly or very likely sleep with whoever.
I'll end up going to the highest bidder.
Yeah, that's kind of one way to put it.
Yeah.
And so you see that a lot. Like I was watching, I saw this interview with this lady, God bless her heart, where she's like, I'm a reformed cheater. And I was like, okay, well, I'm thinking, all right, well, I'm glad she's not doing it anymore.
Is that what she meant by reformed cheater?
Yeah, she's like, I used to do it all the time, but now I don't do it anymore. Okay. And he's like, you'd never do it again? She's like, no. And he goes, well, like, why? She's like, yeah, I'm, especially like not if I'm married. She's like, so, and then they started talking a little bit more. She's like, yeah, and I think everyone's entitled to one cheat. And he's like, so you would still cheat again? She's like, no, I didn't say that. Like, I'm never going to cheat if I'm married. I'm like, so what if you're dating someone? She's like, well, it's not official yet. And I'm like, okay. He's like, well, what if you're engaged? And she's like, well, I don't know. It's like, okay, well, I mean, whether or not you respect the institution of marriage aside, there's clearly a disconnect here about what is the correct thing to do, kind of like going to the highest bidder sort of analogy and everything. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting conversation, to say the least. Yeah,
absolutely. And then obviously this kind of pride doesn't lend itself to successful marriages. It just doesn't. I've been married for almost 7 years now, and I can assure you, I was told before I got married, I was given a piece of advice. God told me that I will never be able to afford a home big enough to house my pride and my wife.
Good Lord. That's a good one.
Yeah, that's what I was told. I'll never be able to afford a house big enough for both of them.
And here I was trying to move and try to get a better place to fit that. Might as well just stick where I'm at, huh?
Yeah, and just swap the pride with humility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that might be a little.
It'll help you. It'll help you.
Yeah, you won't need a storage unit.
That's for
when
sure.
You get divorced.
Yeah, you need that storage unit with that pride. I promise you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I mean, you got that, and if it's difficult to maintain a marriage with pride, I mean, how much more difficult it's going to be to maintain friendships? But you can't maintain a business with pride. There aren't too many relationships where you can be prideful, or any one person in a relationship can be prideful and it's going to thrive. That doesn't exist. Some of these other results, a lot of fighting. You're going to end up in a lot of fights, verbal and perhaps physical. It's also going to lead to loneliness. Yeah. That's where you're going to end up by yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's what pride does. I mean, and I suppose it shouldn't be a surprise. It's all about you anyway. So it only makes sense that one would end up by themselves.
Right.
Right. And then you might very well end up with what you're trying to avoid, which is humility. But this humility may be forced, as opposed to you humbling yourself. The way that God has ordained and structured life will humble you in ways that you can't even imagine.
Or like it says in the Gospels, those who humble themselves will be exalted, but those who exalt themselves will be humbled one way or another.
Absolutely. And it's like you can either just go low yourself, or you can be brought low.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it'd be much easier if you just do it on your own. That's all I got for this one, man. Anything else?
I think that does it.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. What do you guys think? What do you guys think about this topic of pride? Do we nail it? Do we miss some things? Could we have added some things? I know there's some things we could have added for sure.
Yeah.
My mind goes to a couple of different areas, but that's all we got for this episode. Appreciate you guys listening. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your subscriptions. We are growing and growing and growing and growing. Appreciate all the love and support. Be sure to share this episode. But until next time, I am your co-host, Jaylen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
And as always, for the kingdom.